I'm Mike McDermott, and in this video we're going to take a look at two campaigns that occurred relatively early during the course of the Civil War. In the first case, a campaign conducted in the Shenandoah River Valley of Virginia, and in the second case, a big strategic end run that was accomplished by the Union Army to get behind the major Confederate armies who were intent on defending Richmond. Both of these campaigns were strategically important to both sides, and in both cases, we have the opportunity to see both Union and Confederate leaders at this early stage to demonstrate both their strengths and their weaknesses. But first, to the Shenandoah Valley campaign, conducted between the battles of Kernston on 23 March and Port Republic on the 9th of June, 1862. To appreciate this campaign, it's necessary to understand the geography of the valley, which is the watershed of the Shenandoah River. On average, the valley is about 25 miles wide and it extends 140 miles from southwest to northeast. In other words, the Shenandoah River runs from south to north, and it empties into the Potomac River at Harper's Ferry. Located between the Blue Ridge Mountains on the east and the Alleghanies on the west, for almost 50 miles, the valley is split down its length by a 2,900-foot formation called the Massanutten Mountain. In 1862, there was only one road across Massanutten Mountain, which passed through the New Market Gap, allowing movement between the separate halves of the valley, between the eastern side and the western side of the valley. Known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy, the valley's crops were critically important to the government in Richmond. On the 4th of November, 1861, Confederate General Thomas Jackson took command of the Valley District with headquarters in Winchester, Virginia, just 30 miles from Harper's Ferry and the Potomac River. In February of the following year, Union General Nathaniel Banks, with 30,000 men, was ordered to protect the railroad and the canal at the northern end of the valley, that is, near the Potomac River. And on 12 March, he forced the Confederates to vacate Winchester. General Jackson was then ordered to keep the Union force occupied in the valley so that it could not reinforce General McClellan, who had already landed his Union army on the Virginia Peninsula. When General Jackson learned that two of the Union divisions were being withdrawn, he saw an opportunity. After a grueling 40-mile march, he led 3,800 of his soldiers into action against the 8,500 Federals in defensive positions near Kernston, just south of Winchester. Although repulsed and forced to retreat for the only time in his military career, General Jackson accomplished his strategic mission by keeping the Union force in the valley, as those departing Federal divisions were ordered to return and take up positions in the valley. General Jackson's audacity alarmed President Lincoln and other senior politicians in Washington, and General Irwin McDowell's corps of 40,000 men, initially slated to support General McClellan's campaign on the Virginia Peninsula, were ordered rather to secure the capital's defenses, the defenses around Washington. Another Union army of 8,000 men, commanded by General John Fremont, was ordered to move from West Virginia into the Upper Valley to cooperate with General Banks. Following Kernston, the Confederates moved east across the Blue Ridge Mountains, seemingly leaving the valley. However, General Jackson then surprised the Federals by recrossing the Blue Ridge back into the Shenandoah Valley and taking up a strong position overlooking General Fremont's soldiers, who were camped on the western side of the valley. General Jackson then commanded a reinforced army of 17,000 men, and he turned his attention back north down the valley toward the Potomac. Sidestepping the main Union force by crossing Massanutten Mountain through the New Market Gap from west to east, he appeared behind General Banks and overwhelmed a small federal garrison at Port Royal on the 23rd of May. Forced into a hasty withdrawal to protect his communications with Washington, General Banks' column was attacked en route to Winchester, but the Confederate pursuit was delayed as hungry rebels fell out to take advantage of abandoned Union supplies. Defeating General Banks at Winchester on the 25th of May, the rebels continued pushing Union forces back north toward the Potomac. President Lincoln orchestrated a trap by ordering General Banks into the valley with a 10,000-man army to cooperate with General Fremont's 15,000 soldiers. Sensing the danger, General Jackson conducted a forced march to the upper end of the valley, that is, the southern end of the valley, and waited. The advancing Union armies were operating independently on both sides of Massanutten Mountain, and that allowed the rebels to attack them piecemeal, separately. General Jackson first stopped General Fremont on the west side of the valley on the 8th of June, and then he moved to attack General Shields at Port Republic the following day. Once General Jackson's strategic mission had been accomplished, that is, holding federal forces in the Shenandoah Valley, and also diverting those reinforcements that had been intended to join General McClellan, bringing that 40,000 men back to defend Washington, D.C., General Jackson then received orders to cross the Blue Ridge and join the defenses of Richmond. An example of General Jackson's harsh discipline was demonstrated when he court-martialed one of his commanders following that initial fight at Curdston in the northern end of the valley. General Richard Garrett had withdrawn his brigade without orders when his troops ran low on ammunition, and although he was eventually returned to duty, his sense of personal humiliation persisted and affected him until he was eventually killed on the third day at Gettysburg. In a letter to an associate, General Jackson had written, "Always mystify, mislead, and surprise the enemy if possible. And when you strike and overcome him, never let up in the pursuit as long as your men have the strength to follow. For an army routed, if hotly pursued, becomes panic-stricken and can then be destroyed by half their number." An author named Charles Royster summed up Jackson in his book entitled The Destructive War. He ordered hard marches. He denied applications for furloughs. He severely punished infractions of discipline. He arrested officers who departed from his instructions. He had deserters shot. During 3 days in August 1862, 13 of his men were executed for desertion or otherwise disobeying orders. He tried to kill as many of the enemy as possible, and he did not shirk from getting his own men killed in the process of doing it. For him, war was always earnest and lethal. And thus concludes the campaign in the Shenandoah Valley. The Peninsula Campaign was the first large-scale offensive operation conducted by the United States Army in the Eastern Theater. I visualize the Eastern Theater by drawing a big goose egg on a map that includes Washington, D.C. at the north and Richmond, Virginia at the south. I would estimate that 75–80% of the Civil War was fought in that goose egg, and the bulk of the casualties of the Civil War occurred between Washington and the vicinity of Richmond. The campaign consisted of a massive end run to bypass the bulk of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, which was deployed to intercept an invasion of Virginia from the Washington area. On the 17th of March, 1862, the Union Army began going aboard transports, Navy transports, at Alexandria on the Potomac River, and after transiting the Chesapeake Bay, they disembarked at Fort Monroe in southeastern Virginia. When General McClellan arrived on the 2nd of April, he found his army of 50,000 men on the ground, organized and ready for action. General McClellan had actually accomplished an extraordinary strategic surprise. The Confederates had simply not anticipated the possibility that he would bypass their defenses, arrayed against an army attacking from the Washington area, and he was ashore with an organized army, and the Confederates were simply not ready to receive him. 2 days after arriving, he began advancing the army up the Virginia Peninsula between the York and James Rivers. The York River would be on his right to the north, and the James River on his left to the south. And in fact, the James River is navigable on up as far as Richmond. With an army now grown to 102,000 men, General McClellan halted at Lee's Mill, south of Yorktown, where the Confederates put up a deceptively realistic demonstration of strength. Confederate General John Magruder, commanding 11,000 men, successfully held up the complete Union Army while awaiting reinforcements for himself. Eventually, he had about 35,000 men. A master of deception, General Magruder bought time while the Federals overestimated his numbers and began emplacing siege guns to carry out a step-by-step, by-the-book assault of General Magruder's defensive positions. By the end of April, the reinforced Confederates, now under the command of General Joseph Johnson, were improving entrenchments while more reinforcements were on the way. Among them, General Thomas Jackson, after conducting his series of battles in the Shenandoah Valley. Recognizing the overwhelming power of the impending Federal attack, on the night of 3 May, the Confederates fired a barrage to cover the withdrawal from Yorktown, and they left General McClellan to face their abandoned fortifications. 2 days later, the first real battle of the campaign took place when Confederate troops made a stand to cover that retrograde movement. Known as the Battle of Williamsburg, 32,000 rebel soldiers engaged 41,000 Federal soldiers in a series of attacks and counterattacks that provided time for the Confederate wagon trains, hampered by heavy rains, atrocious roads, and a sea of mud, allowing them to escape to Richmond. Under cover of darkness, the rebels then pulled their troops back closer to those Richmond defenses. Federal casualties during this phase of the action totaled about 2,200 men, and the Confederates lost about 1,700 soldiers during those preliminary fights. The Army of the Potomac continued to maneuver against the rebels defending Richmond. General McClellan, convinced he was outnumbered and calling for more reinforcements, decided that his best approach to the Confederate capital required shifting his army to the south side of the Chickahominy River. The bulk of the Union Army was still north of the river, while 2 Federal corps had been able to cross, but then were attacked by Confederate General Johnson on the 31st of May. The Battle of Fair Oaks, also known as the Battle of Seven Pines, was a tactical draw, although General Johnson was badly wounded and replaced by General Robert E. Lee. General Lee had previously commanded a relatively small force in northern Virginia and had not particularly distinguished himself, although now he had the opportunity to show his skills. General McClellan then consolidated the Union Army south of the river, except for 1 corps, whose mission was to maintain contact with his logistics base on the York River. The bulk of General McClellan's forces got busy digging trenches and emplacing siege guns, intending to eventually attack the Richmond fortifications. And again, General McClellan was wedded to a step-by-step siege procedure following the book. General Lee dispatched cavalry on a reconnaissance to gather information about the Federals' north flank. That Confederate cavalry ride around the Federal Army, an accomplishment of dubious overall value, although it got a great deal of positive press, alerted the Union commander to the vulnerability of his base on the York River and encouraged him to relocate it to the James River for greater security. The new location also allowed his logisticians to more directly support the force. The Confederates then concentrated the bulk of their troops north of the Chickahominy River with the mission of overwhelming that single Union corps located in the vicinity of Mechanicsville. The Confederates kept about 25,000 men south of the river to put on another convincing demonstration to hold the bulk of the Union troops in place. The Confederate attack against that isolated corps started late on the 26th of June, but was disjointed and driven back with heavy casualties. The following day, 57,000 rebels attacked again, and they gained an indecisive victory at Gaines' Mill, forcing the 34,000 Federal troops to withdraw and to cross the river and join General McClellan, destroying their bridges after they had gained the southern side of the Chickahominy. At that point, General McClellan ordered his army to pull back to the newly established logistics base at Harrison's Landing on the James River. After almost 3 months of maneuvering up and down the peninsula, only one of his 5 corps had been heavily engaged, and it had done well against the Confederates. But the hesitation and the caution marking the campaign continued to drive General McClellan's decisions to break off the offensive to capture Richmond. General Lee attempted to take advantage of opportunities by attacking the flank of the Union Army as it retreated. First at Savage's Station and then Frazier's Farms, but those fights were inconclusive. General McClellan was able to concentrate the Union Army at Malvern Hill, an excellent defensive position with good observation, artillery positions, and fields of fire across a broad open space. I visited Malvern Hill some years ago, and it is an absolutely perfect defensive position. The Confederates were forced to advance through swampy lowlands and flooded timber, all perfectly observable from Malvern Hill. And instead of attempting to outflank the Union position, General Lee ordered a head-on uphill attack into the Union strength, which proved disastrous for the Confederates. The next day, 2 July, the Union troops withdrew to their base at Harrison's Landings, and the Confederate troops also pulled back, in their case, to defensive positions around Richmond. The 7 days battle from Mechanicsville to Malvern Hill was marked by poor intelligence, excessive caution, particularly on the part of the Union commander, and hesitation interrupted by fierce attacks and staunch defenses. Poor communications over swampy roads and across flooded rivers, as well as uncoordinated maneuvers, also described those 7 days. General McClellan's campaign was over except to return the army to the Washington area, a task that he accomplished during August. General Lee had protected Richmond, but at great cost. His total losses were about 29,000 men, while the Federals suffered approximately 23,000 killed or wounded. That battle at Gaines' Mill, that attack against the isolated Union Corps north of the river, made a strong impression on the participants of both sides. Confederate General D.H. Hill later recalled the many assaults that he had ordered on Union lines that day. And he wrote, "It was thought to be a great thing to charge a battery of artillery or earthworks lined by infantry. We were very lavish with blood in those days." A Confederate soldier, a man named A.N. Herskin, wrote his wife about some of that fight. "I never had a clear conception of the horrors of war until that night. On going around on that battlefield with a candle, searching for my friends, I could hear on all sides the groans of the wounded and their heart-piercing cries for water and assistance, friends and foes all mixed together." At the end of the campaign, General McClellan wrote his commander-in-chief, President Lincoln, intent on shifting the blame for the failure to capture Richmond. And he wrote, "If I save this army now, I tell you plainly that I owe no thanks to you or to any other persons in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army." While General McClellan's message certainly smacks of insubordination, he makes a firm effort to shift responsibility from his shoulders to the president's shoulders. General McClellan, by all accounts, was an accomplished organizer and trainer, but he was certainly an inadequate field commander. And he would get a second opportunity to demonstrate his inadequacy commanding in the field. He loved to be compared to Napoleon, but unlike Napoleon, he insisted on shifting the responsibility to others, to include the president. His ego simply never allowed him to acknowledge any fault or any failure on his part. And thus ends the Peninsular Campaign. Don't hesitate to make comments concerning these campaigns. And until the next video, all the best to each and every one, and God bless America.